It is time for this week's Rising Star segment, where we celebrate the very best that this country has to offer. Now, from his journey into the country in the back of a refrigerated container when he was just 4 months old, to recently being elected British Afghan Conservative candidate in this year's local elections, this young man is one to watch in the world of politics. I'm delighted to welcome Darius Nasimi into the GB News studio. Let's cut straight to the chase, because you know this, you've dealt with the arguments left, right and centre. What do you say to people who say you should never have been here, you shouldn't have been in the back of that lorry? What on earth are you doing here in this country?
Well, I think the reason my family escaped Afghanistan was because we were escaping the Taliban regime. My parents had studied outside Afghanistan, both my father and my mother, and it was impossible for my family to remain in Afghanistan, where their freedoms were being curtailed. They didn't have the liberty to express their political beliefs, and they didn't have the opportunity to lead the lives that they wanted to. And it had become impossible for them to stay in Afghanistan in a society where human rights and women's rights and basic fundamental values that we have in other parts of the world no longer existed in that country.
We'll talk about what you're doing in the business world as well as the political world in just a moment, but having been here since you were a tiny wee tot, and you're now a fully grown, functioning adult and getting into all sorts of stuff, does it surprise you that so many in this country cannot make that distinction between somebody who is genuinely in fear of their life, a refugee, and someone who's actually just here taking the mickey economically?
Yeah, I think that is a big problem that exists in our society. People often misunderstand the difference between being a refugee or an asylum seeker and being an economic migrant. And when people listen to those stories, they often label everyone who's a refugee as an economic migrant, when the two are clearly different. A refugee is somebody who is fleeing their country because of some form of religious, ethnic or political persecution. Whereas, of course, economic migrants are people who travel to another place for economic reasons. Now, the situation in Afghanistan is once again changed before 2001, before the NATO intervention. For the last 20 years, the situation had improved. We had civil society, women's rights improved. As a result of the NATO presence, we had reconstruction, the infrastructure was developing, we had a number of successful democratic elections, millions of girls were going to school, we had female MPs and politicians. But then now, I think the whole of the international community, and I'd like to thank the UK government for being the first country to evacuate over 15,000 people from Afghanistan to the